You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by BBBGive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by BBBGive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator and your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I am Art Taylor, your host, and with me today is Pratichi Shah, the CEO and founder of Flourish Talent Management. It is a consultancy that works with organizations on their human resource management issues, including issues associated with aligning an organization's culture with its strategy. And when those two are aligned, organizations can achieve more. Pratichi started out in corporate America in human resource management and then progressed to a nonprofit organization where she was the chief talent officer. Later on, she decided to branch out on her own and start Flourish Talent Management. And I will tell you, she is one of the most sought after and appreciated consultants in the business. And I've had the personal opportunity to work with her, and she is quite impressive. Today, we get to talk to her about all the issues she works on, including why she transitioned from business to now leading a consultancy that empowers others to do great things. Pratichi, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Thank you.
Well, Pratichi, it's really wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with you, someone who is a consultant in our sector dealing with talent management. And obviously, what I think a lot of our listeners may not appreciate is that nonprofit organizations really do have paid staff, and that it's okay to pay people to do things. It's not a waste of your money, and they really can accomplish great things for organizations. And obviously, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. And it's not unreasonable for people to misunderstand the role of staff, because the vast majority of nonprofit organizations operate with entirely volunteer teams. If there are 1.3 million organizations, probably 2/3 or more have no paid staff and raise really small amounts of money, and they're operated by people who care about that particular mission and they're giving their time. But then the rest of the organizations really do have paid staff, paid people doing things that are in furtherance of their missions. And they need to manage those people well. And those people really need to feel connected, and they need to build a culture together. And these are all things I gather you help organizations do in your practice with Flourish Talent Management.
Indeed, that was all incredibly well said. And I would say, yes, nonprofits, philanthropies, charities do employ people. And those people are doing extraordinary work with limited resources. And so I would say, yes, it is absolutely okay to pay people for work that is oriented around service. And I will add to that, it is not only okay, but fantastic to build a career in the sector that seeks to serve. And so if people are kind of thinking about, hey, you know what? I want to give back. Like, what does that mean? This sector is an extraordinary place to build one's career. You'll get it all. You'll get a very keen view into society and what makes society run, what parts work well, what parts don't. You'll get leadership, you'll get project management, you'll get service, and you'll get camaraderie and collegiality. So yeah, I think it's all of that. I think it's all of that. And I have the great privilege, as you said, to work with some amazing organizations that do so much with actually pretty smallish staffs, which was a big surprise to me when I came to the sector, seeing really big names that we run across in mainstream media and articles, things like that, and realizing that in fact, that work is done by 10, 15, maybe 25, 30 people. So it's not, organizations are not run by thousands of people. It's really limited staff that do a lot.
Well, we were talking about the fact that people could have careers in the nonprofit sector.
Mm-hmm.
You've actually done both, right? You were also at one time the chief talent officer in a nonprofit, but you also had a similar role in a business, in a corporation. Are there differences in your mind, and what was it that maybe made you leap from one to the other and now have your own sort of business supporting the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, there are some differences. Thank you for that question. There are some differences. For me, the leap came about, honestly, because of values dissonance. There was just a gap from what I was experiencing, right, in the values of the organization and the company at that time, which granted, corporate social responsibility has evolved considerably. This is almost 15 years ago. So corporate social responsibility, the notion of the corporation as a global citizen and as a community member has evolved a lot. So I don't have a sense of what that reality might be if you're there right now. But for me, it was just, I really want to be around service. And I want to be around people who think about service at that societal level. I think that was really intriguing for me. And I think that's one of the biggest differences is the mission, whatever subsector of the nonprofit world you might be in. You might be focused on poverty, education, environment, animals, and civil rights, any of those. The mission is always top of mind. And that the mission is about service is always top of mind. There might be disagreement or different ways of looking at how that mission might get accomplished or the long-term goals, etc. But the mission is so top of mind. And I didn't experience that in the corporate world in which there were other things that were top of mind. Client service was top of mind. Accuracy in products delivered was top of mind, but service not necessarily in my experience. And so for me, that was a big part of it. And then that grew, as you said. I landed at a big national nonprofit and was their chief talent officer. And then I started the business in hopes that I could be of service to those who do service. And that was the goal of the business.
Well, I know a lot of clients of yours are very happy that you did. And we've
Thank
worked
you.
together for quite a number of years, and I can certainly vouch for the quality of your work. And
Thank
I'm
you.
very pleased that we were able to connect on some projects. Pratichi, you have an
After I
Indian.
insisted that you talk to me at a conference.
Well, I'll never forget that. We were over at the Capitol, and we were presenting to a group of congressional staff leaders about the work we're doing in the nonprofit sector around accountability and transparency. And you were good enough to come over and reintroduce yourself.
That's right.
And I guess we've been sort of connected since then, and it's been great. It's also been great to have you on our board. In full disclosure, it's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Pratichi, I wanted to talk a bit about your ethos for giving and service. And I know that you have an Indian heritage to go along with your now very deep American roots. And I wonder if the combination of family, American ideals, Indian heritage have in some ways shaped, and I'm sure they have to some degree, your brand of giving and serving, and how they maybe together motivate you every day to not only work in this space, but decide to make a career out of it.
Yeah, it hinges, you're right. It's based on so many things. I think that there is an orientation in Indian culture around family and community and how you can orient towards others, how you can be in service. I think a really common question, a common dialogue, if you will, in conversation is always, do you need anything? Do you
Mm.
have what you need? Is there something I can do? And obviously, this is really top of mind as I watch so many people, including my family, grapple with what's going on in India right now with COVID. That phrase occurs continuously. Is there anything I can do? Do you need anything? Can I bring you something? Which obviously, if you're dealing with people across the ocean, not as practical. But I think that does orient you towards service. I mean, my family, my entire family, gives to charity, and that's always been a part of our lives. I've always been quite conscious of that. And so I think that did inform my desire to then think about, okay, so how do I do that? Do I do that through my work? Do I make a donation somewhere? And kind of thinking that through is what led me to say, you know what, I think I want to go over there, meaning over to the nonprofit sector, and do some work there and see what that's like. And little did I know, as at the time a layperson to the sector, just how big the sector was, how layered it was, in that there's so much more than a layperson or a donor outside of the sector might see. There are organizations that address so many issues, and organizations that address the very work of charities themselves, as you well know, and the Wise Giving Alliance well knows. So what I was stunned by is, wow, there's a lot of ways to kind of be part of this thing. I didn't really know that. So that was very exciting. And it built on that foundation that had been laid via my family of, how do you give back? How do you think about community? How do you contribute in some meaningful way?
Yeah. I think I mentioned to you that we had Rajani Saigal from
Mm,
Ikaw on just recently, and she was talking about the work they're doing in rural villages in India. I think they're
hmm.
reaching over 100,000 rural villages, if you can imagine that,
Wow.
and providing educational services through schools, healthcare, and economic development. And she talked about how they were able to marry the economic development with the healthcare to some extent in the schools too, to create masks for people in those villages to help them keep the COVID numbers down. And the first time around, when the surge
Great.
was large, they were able to keep villages fairly well protected. She's worried now because of the variants. I'm just curious, what are you hearing anything from your family members at home about the situation and how maybe Americans can be supportive of organizations like Ikaw?
Yeah. What I've been thrilled about is to see the situation covered in both, certainly within our sector, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and others, including, I proudly say, Wise Giving Alliance has
Yeah.
kind of covered the ways in which to give to India. It's also been in mainstream media. So finding those articles about what are the best ways to give back, I think are incredibly important, because the situation is pervasive, is the only word I
Mm,
can think of. Is,
mm,
at this point, when we've talked to family, it's been hard to understand how it's even being transmitted. So all the precautions are being taken, multiple layers of precautions are being taken, and people are still getting it, from what I understand.
mm.
And again, I say this not as an infectious disease person or a medical
Sure.
person, but from what I understand, despite all the precautions, it keeps spreading. And individual precautions are not necessarily providing the levels of protection that we would hope that they would. So I think because of that, because it is so pervasive, because there is such a density of populations, both in cities and even in rural areas, thinking in terms of, where do I want to give? Lots of different organizations like Ekaw Vidalia are giving lots of different options of how to give, and they're being really great, I think, around saying, if you give this much, it provides PPE, for instance, or it provides families X amount of equipment for even greater protection, or it provides food. So I think people are doing a great job of breaking that down. And I think that there are so many other organizations, the Association for India Development, Give India, the India Philanthropic Alliance, Share and Care Foundation, all of those, along with Ikaw, are just doing some really fantastic work. I think the biggest thing, honestly, just to kind of straight shoot it, is to give. I mean, there is a tremendous need right now for support, and to the extent that people can lean into that, it would be amazing.
Well, thanks for sharing that and your family's experiences, and certainly our thoughts and prayers go out to all the people in India who
Thank
are
you.
dealing with something that it feels like it's obviously out of their control. And you know how that
Mm.
can have a personal toll on an individual.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Art. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate how much the Wise Giving Alliance looks at charity at a global level and looks at issues at a global level. I was thrilled to see the newsletter that really highlighted ways to give to India. So, on a personal note, thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Pratichi, so let's get into your work a little bit because it's
Okay.
so important. We talked about COVID, but obviously it hasn't just affected a region, it's affected the world. Here in America, we watched all sorts of organizations in our sector have to shift from how they were doing business
Mm,
to a new way of doing business, primarily virtual. We saw fundraising events happen online and through Zoom. We saw charities shift their operations so that people could actually work from home rather than coming into an office. Some organizations had to shut down. I remember having a conversation with Kevin Washington, the CEO of the YMCA, who you know,
hmm
and Kevin mentioned that for months they just had to shut Wise down. And what do you do if you're the YMCA and your business is to have people come to the facility to partake of the services? You know, they were very creative in that they used those facilities for other things that were helpful during the pandemic. But I would suspect, Pratichi, that these shifts are having cultural changes affected in organizations as well. Among your clients, I wonder what you're seeing. How are organizations coping with this? I know that we've been concerned about people working from home and having the right resources to do that and the right room to work from home. And as we come out of this, maybe that's changing. And how is that changing? Just curious about your thoughts and what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think what you just touched on there is one of the first things that had to be confronted, right? Because not everyone has access. I mean, it's easy to say, hey, you know what? I have kind of a more typical 9 to 5-ish job, a desk job, and I can just work from home. But right, that assumes a place to do so. That assumes the level of quiet. That assumes access to broadband or some sort of high speed internet. It assumes a lot of things, and it assumes a computer, right, at home, and a video camera ideally, and all those kinds of things. And I think that was the first thing that many organizations had to confront, is that what is our ability to support people, and how can we distribute support in a way that is equitable to ensure that those who are not set up to work at home are, and at the same time acknowledging those who had to go deep into caregiving mode. So, parents, those who had elder care responsibilities, or any other kind of care responsibilities. How can we create some kind of elasticity for let them to be able to do what they need to do? I mean, I think those were the two big things that we had to confront within this sector, but in all sectors, right? So, one, kind of making sure that people have what they need, and two, making sure that people have a level of elasticity and flexibility to do what they need to do, because as we all know, life and work became one, and they were all happening in the same place. So, and roles that were slightly separate were now happening simultaneously. So how do you constantly pivot from being a caregiver to being a teacher to being the person, whatever your role is in your organization? And so I think that was the first part, Then I saw a lot of organizations happily pivot into kind of how do we support the mental health needs of our employees, of our teams, because people were leading on issues, working on issues related to health, related to wellness and the pandemic, of course, related to racial justice, related to inequity in society, but they were also living those issues. So, how do we give people enough mental space and support to acknowledge both that you're working on and living the same set of issues? And so I saw a lot of organizations really pivot into that. So some of them were doing it by giving time, which I think is always appreciative because time can create space. So some of them were doing it by providing actual proactive resources around mental health. Some of them were doing it by providing trainings and learnings, if you will, on kind of self-care practices and that kind of thing. But I think we saw that take on a much more present and palpable role than I've ever seen in organizations. I think typically organizations have said, like, hey, we have health and welfare packages, right? We have health insurance, and with that is some mental health support. And this time it was much more palpable and it was much more proactive and it was present and it stayed present. Do I think that every organization got it exactly right? Probably not, because right is relative to what that particular team needs. So I don't think there's an absolute right, but I saw lots of organizations really leaning into this. And I think now where we have pivoted is figuring out kind of what the future is going to be. So if it's hybrid, what does hybrid look like? Is it a model that differs by person as to when someone's in the office versus not? Is it by the entire organization? Like, hey, we're all going to buy into being in the office on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or whatever, and then off on our own other days. But really kind of figuring that out based on what the organization needs to do and based on what's going to give people comfort. Because it's not just being in the building, it's getting there, it's getting other family members taken care of, so you can actually get to a physical building. So there's a lot that goes into that. And I think people are very much kind of pivoting into that conversation now, while making sure, and I think this is really important, that we don't lose the things that came out, the good things about working that came out of having to reinvent work last year.
Are there some leaders in terms of things that you think will continue with us once we come out of the pandemic?
I think the focus on supporting people in whatever their life circumstances are. I think that partly it's a generational thing, right? So I'm a Gen Xer, and we were very distinctly, clearly, and explicitly told that, leave your life outside, leave your emotions outside. You're here to do a job, basically suck it up and do your work. And certainly less so in our sector. I experience that much less in our sector than other sectors. But I think that the level, again, of acknowledgement of people's different life circumstances last year was significant and is one that shouldn't be lost. The acknowledgement of the whole person coming to work and thereby bringing their worries, their concerns, their various caretaking and familial and community roles. Can all of those be acknowledged by the organization as the employer every second of every day? Probably not, but creating space for people to be who they are and who they are in that moment is incredibly important. And I think that needs to come with us. And then finally, the flexibility, right, around the physicality of where you work needs to come with us.
Let me ask you about one thing I know you work on, and that is organizational culture. And I know that if I were to speak to the average person on the street who gives to a charity, they may be details that that person might never really care to understand, but they're important. And I wonder how you would describe culture for one point, and then secondly, why it's so important for an organization to have the right culture in place, because it does drive performance. And I know all donors are interested in performance. All stakeholders of a nonprofit are interested and have a vested interest in that organization performing well. So how do the two relate?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great concept, right? And one that has kind of been examined and studied, and for HR and organizational development nerds like me, it's been kind of a central focus for sure for those who have escaped that level of interaction with culture. What I would say is, look, an organizational culture is everything you experience while working there, right? It's whether you have meetings that involve going out and getting a cup of coffee, or whether you have formal meetings pre-pandemic in conference rooms. It is how decisions are made and whether that is shared, not just how they're made as far as where in the organization they're made or if they're made by consensus or with input, but if that process is even shared and if it's explicit or not, and not, not necessarily good or bad, but all of those things make up the culture. It is the way, again, pre-pandemic, the way that we interact in offices, the way offices are set up. In the last year, it has meant kind of how many meetings we have. Are they all Zoom meetings? Do we kind of do informal things so that we can be with each other without talking about work? And our cameras required to be on, or our cameras okay to be off? And again, neither one is a good or a bad thing, but it's all of those things. It's everything that you experience as an employee, as a leader, as a stakeholder, even as a board member or a volunteer. How you experience that organization, all of that is its culture. The reason it matters is because it will either stand in your way as you try to get work done, or it will kind of buoy you up and help you progress and do your work. At its most oversimplified, I would say otherwise, it is what helps you do your work. It's what kind of lifts your spirits and connects you in our sector to the mission of the organization, and says, you know what, we got this. We're going to do this. We're facing obstacles, but we can do this. It is creativity. It is innovation. It is flexibility. It is all of those kinds of things that ultimately let the work happen. That's why it matters. So I always forget who said and I know I should know this as someone who studied culture forever, but the quote about, culture eats strategy for breakfast, I think that was Peter Drucker.
Yeah.
I feel like I might be too old to remember who did that anymore, but there's a reason that quote, among those who look at management and culture and human resources and organizational development, there's a reason that quote kind of took hold, right? Because there's truth to it. It is that thing that surrounds you all the time that you can't hold in your hand, but that propels you forward or holds you back.
Yeah. That's very well said, because I have experienced organizations that purport to have a goal or something that they want to accomplish, but the way people work doesn't necessarily allow that to happen. So I guess one example might be an organization whose culture might be out of balance is one in which, let's say, they do a lot of government contracting where the rules are very rigid and they're very strict and people have to follow protocols. But yet the organization's culture is that, people kind of work their own schedule. That would seem to be a little misaligned, right? Or if you're an individual who likes to work your own schedule and you're working for an organization that has to meet goals and deadlines and so forth because of what you do, then you're kind of not going to be able to function well, it would seem, in that type of organization, right? So culturally, there's a misalignment.
That's exactly right. That's so well said. And that is exactly the misalignment that we're looking to kind of make sure it doesn't happen. Some of that is the individual assessing, like, am I in the right place to do my best work? And some of it is the organization saying, okay, so we're going to provide a culture. It's not going to be perfect for everyone, because an organization is a collection of diverse individuals with different needs and different ways of thinking about things and different preferences and processing. So it is creating a culture that has enough flexibility to appeal to lots of different styles, and at the same time is connected to the mission to say, you know what, if our mission is accomplished through levels of innovation, levels of creativity, levels of empathy, then we have the culture that supports those very things that we need in order to get our work done.
Well, Pratichi, we'll end the first episode here, And I'm looking forward to having you for an additional episode, which I hope all of our listeners will tune in for. This is the Heart of Giving podcast. I'm Art Taylor, the host. Please listen to us and subscribe on all major podcast platforms. Thank you.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.